Okay, hello everybody and welcome to our Apex Workshop webinar. This is our 12th meeting and today we will talk about Visualforce. Before we jump into the gist where we have the code we'll be working with tonight, I wanted to go over a couple of things. So, in order for us to use Visualforce, we actually need to understand a few other pieces of knowledge, some things that we need to go over. So with that, I wanted to kind of preface this meeting today by saying that we are going to go over some new concepts, and there's several of them that I want to get through. I will try to be detailed and kind of go through them relatively quickly, or at least as quickly as I feel I should be, but because many of those are new concepts for us, I do ask that if you have any questions or anything is not clear, I'm going too fast, or I'm just not explaining it well enough, please stop interrupting me. We have Luke and we have Bill here today to help us and help me if I can't explain anything or if I forget what something is. Unlike the previous 11 sessions where Luke was running them and I was in the background assisting, today I will lead this session. I built this session together with Bill Martinez, who is our co-presenter. And so hopefully you'll find this interesting. And with that, I will start. So I'm going to try and share my screen. This is going to be the first time I do that. So please give me a second. And if everything worked well, you should see the gist on your screen right now.
I do.
Woohoo! Success. Okay, so I prepared a little document here to show us what we are going to cover today. So we'll start by talking a little bit about what is Visualforce. Why would we even need to use that? We've concentrated our previous 11 session on Apex and only Apex. So what is this Visualforce? Why do we need it? And in order to use Visualforce, we need to have a couple of other pieces of information and understand a few other things. What is a controller? What is a controller extension? What is a constructor? We'll go over schema class, how we can use it. We'll go over what getters and setters are, things that are very important when we want to work with Visualforce, but can be also used when we're not using Visualforce. We'll talk a little bit about the S-object data type. So we talked a lot about what S-objects are, but there's actually an S-object data type, and we'll see what that does today. We'll talk a little bit about what's the difference between private and public variables. And finally, after we go through all of this, we'll actually look at some Visualforce code. We'll go through the code, and hopefully we'll be able to see the result. So I'm not necessarily going to go over all this before we go into the code, but as we go through the code, we'll touch each one of these topics. So let's start with what is Visualforce. Every admin is familiar with the page layout, right? The page layout is what Salesforce gives us that allows us to modify how our users interact with the page, with the data. Sorry, I went into reports. But you are all familiar with the account page layout, for example, where you have up to 2 columns. You can have buttons on the top. You have your related list on the bottom. And you can add sections, you can add fields, you can add links, and you can add a few other things on this page layout. Overall, when you look at the page layout, it's extremely powerful. It allows you to customize your user's experience to a fairly high level or high degree, and allows us as admins to create new functionality based on new objects, implement related lists, links, link different objects, and really we can create relatively full solutions with just page layouts and custom objects and flow. But of course, as we are talking here about development, obviously we're going to look at how we can extend and increase what admins can do by themselves. So Visualforce is the language that complements Apex, and it's a language that is a markup tool. What does that mean? So everybody on this call has at least once heard of the term HTML. And HTML is a language that allows developers to create web pages. And so Visualforce is, just like Apex is built on Java and extends it with functionality that is specific to Salesforce, Visualforce is built on HTML and extends it with functionality that is specific to Salesforce as well. And so we will use Visualforce when we want to create some kind of user interface or interaction with the user that we cannot do with a standard page layout. So like everything else, there's a lot more to learn. And in fact, in our session today is not going to be an all-inclusive list of how to use Visualforce. In fact, while we are going to review Visualforce today, and we'll definitely look at the basics, we're not going to dive very deep into what you can do with Visualforce. In order to do that, I highly recommend you go through the Visualforce trailhead. And I will include that link, of course, in our resources after this meeting, in the after call, in the after email. But there is a Visualforce Basics trailhead that gets you really, really familiar with what is Visualforce and how you can create and edit them, and takes you all the way to doing some things that are similar to what we will do today. And it also gets you some of the things that we probably won't review today. I apologize for coughing and clearing my throat a lot. So with that in mind, so far what we have done in our previous 11 sessions is we used Apex to modify how Salesforce handles our data. So that means we use triggers and we use classes to modify what happens to the data when users interact with it, or when we modify the data through a data loader or anything else. So we mostly worked with triggers, and so that means that, for example, a trigger on an account object, every time we perform either an insert or an update, depending on how we define the trigger, something will happen to this data. We can do some processing, and everything is great. We all reviewed that, and I think we all know how to use these things. But with Visualforce, what we're trying to do is actually not just modify how the data is updated, but also drive some unique user interface. And so let me load the page that we're going to look at today. And so to create an Apex, a Visualforce class, you actually can do there's a couple ways to do it. If you append your Salesforce base URL with the word Apex, and then type whatever name, it will say page whatever name does not exist. In fact, I think there's a setting somewhere that allows you to create Visualforce right from here, and I should have tested it before, but we can see this page does not exist. And so, like everything else, we'll go into the developer console, where we can click New, Visualforce Page, type the name of the page, and we now have a brand new Visualforce page. And if I do exactly the same thing that I just did here, we now get this blank page because, of course, there's nothing on the page, but it did not give me that error again. So every Visualforce that we create is accessible using that Apex notation and then the name of the page. There's also the ability to create tabs, like custom objects where we can create tabs. We can create tabs for Visualforce pages. And so in order to do that, I'm going to create tabs. And instead of custom object tabs, I'm going actually to go down to Visualforce tabs and click New. I have to select my page. This is the page we're working on. I'm going to call it Contact Query. We get to select our little icon. So in this case, I'll see some, let's do IP phone, why not? We can put a description. Now, the name is actually a bit misleading. We call the page name contact query, but it actually no longer does that. Just like anything else, we can define who can see this tab. In this case, I'm going to give everybody permission. We'll add it to all of the application. Now, let's just add it to our sales app. And you can see now that contact query tab that I created, when I click on it, it actually takes us to a brand new page. And you can see this page doesn't look like any standard Salesforce page layout that we've ever seen before. So what I want to do is first show you what this page does. And after we see what it does, we'll start to dive in and we'll see how we built this page. So this page allows us to query objects. And you can see that in this drop-down here, it says select the object you would like to query. And when I click on it, I can see all of the objects in my organization. So I'm going to select, for example, the account object. Once I selected it, you can see that automatically this area refreshed and shows me the fields on the account object. Now I can select any other object as well. Let's say cases, for example. And we can see that actually the case fields are now visible in this box. And once I do that, let's say, let's select, for example, let's just go with account because I know what to search. But I'm going to say, show me account where account type contains the word customer. And so I'm going to query. And now I can see actually a result of all of the accounts where the type contains the word customer. So we get customer channel and customer direct and all of these accounts. And we get a set of different fields from that record. So how did we create a page that allows us to do so much dynamic kind of records searching? So let's start to dive a little bit into our code. And what I'm going to start with, I'm actually going to start with the Visualforce page. And so when you build a Visualforce, and you saw when I created a brand new one, I have here something that's called our tags. So just like in Apex, where we have to define the beginning of a class, and then we use those open curly brackets and open and close curly brackets to show where. Sorry, one second. Look, how do I bring up the, never mind, I got it. Are you still seeing my screen?
Oh, how do we see the Apex?
To the slide.
Yeah, I think I was trying to see the chat, but instead I clicked back. Okay, I see it now. I'm not very familiar with the
yeah, the interface is not as the admin interface.
Wow! Thank you, whoever that was, for that song.
Right now, we're seeing your developer console.
Okay. Good. So, as I was saying, just like with classes where we had to define where they start and where they end, the same thing happens with Visualforce. With Visualforce, again, just like HTML, we use those, what do they call these type of brackets? Anybody knows? Well, in any case, every tag is prefixed, of course, by this open bracket and closed with this bracket. And in Visualforce, everything that we do has to be encapsulated in these tags. So you can see here that I'm starting an Apex page. And in order to close that tag, we have exactly the same thing, and it starts with a backslash. So if I want to add anything else here, for example, I'll add Apex form. You can see Salesforce automatically adds the close tag for that. Yeah. Sorry. And so what's also important is the order in which I open and close these tags. So if I opened my form after the page, the form has to close before I close the page. And so if I move this tag below, you can see I'm starting to get this red highlight saying, hey, you can't close this page right now because there's something else that's happening that's it's not the time yet to close the page. And in fact, it says the element page Apex form must be terminated by the matching end tag. And so we can see this end tag right here. There's one more trick. Some tags, actually, you don't need to have anything in the middle. So here I can say this is a test. And when I save it, I can click this preview button, which takes me to the page. And you can see now it says this is a test on this page. There's really nothing special I did here. Some tags, I don't actually have to have anything inside. So for example, we can have another tag called page block section. And the page block section can have something called title. And so what you can see is that just like with Apex methods or Apex classes that we have methods, right? So we can use the dot notation, for example, string dot value of or things like that. Tags also have these different properties that control some different things about them. And so one of the cool things we can do is as we click space after that, Salesforce actually shows us what properties are available for us to use. So that's very useful, but just like everything else, our best friend is Google, and with that, the developer's manual. And you can read all about page block section. And here's a code example that uses it. And here, all of the attributes, or as I call them properties, but the right term is attributes. Here are all of the attributes that we can use and what each one of them means. So title, for example, is a string that allows us to provide a text displayed as the title of the page block section. So if I do this, you see now this section is this tag is closed right after. I can save it. One of the cool things, by the way, that I like is that if you use the preview button and you go to the page from here, whenever you save the page and you go back here, it actually automatically refreshes it. In here, it actually tells us a page block component must be contained within a page block component. Page block section must be contained inside a page block. So even here, I can already see something is wrong, and it actually tells me some useful information. But we can see that there actually wasn't any kind of compiler error, because beyond just the order of things, there's really no kind of compile errors. There's no compilers that compiles these pages in advance. So with the exception of things like the order of things or referencing variables that don't exist, we won't really get a lot of errors. But at the same time, when we try to view a page, when we try to view the page, many times we will see the error that causes some issue. So it was telling me that I have to put an Apex page block before. So let's do that. And I'm going to have to copy this tag be after the section. I'm going to do my auto indent that I love so much and that works on Visualforce as well. And you'll see that as I save this page is going to automatically refresh. And so you can see now this is actually a page block section. And page block section actually has this ability to hide the section just like we have in page layouts. Page block also has a title attribute. So I can put title here. This is the block. And again, as I save it, this page will automatically be refreshed and we can see this title as well. Now, I was starting to say earlier, some tags may not require us to have anything here. We can put some things here, for example, text in the block section. And we can see that this is now showing in the block section. But if I didn't want to do this, one trick that I can do is actually close this tag right within the initiating tag. So if I just add this backslash at the end of my tag, I'm opening it, doing something, and closing it with one tag. And we can see that the end result is the same. The big difference is that now I can't really do anything contained within this page block section. So this is really kind of the structure of a Visualforce page. Okay, so everything is always contained within tags. We have some very cool and very specific Apex tags. There are also HTML tags that you can talk. So if you've ever touched HTML, you probably know things like table and then close table. Sorry, it automatically closed it. And then we can have things like TD and TR. And so again, if you ever worked with HTML, you're probably familiar with those tags, because those are pretty much HTML tags. There's nothing specific to Apex about them, nothing unique to Salesforce. But Salesforce being built on HTML, it actually supports HTML just like any other HTML page. In fact, Apex will also support CSS, which is the language that we use to design the look and feel of HTML code. And in fact, what you don't see behind the scene is that even if you don't use CSS, CSS stands, by the way, for Cascading Style Sheet, Salesforce actually applies its own style sheet, which drives and makes all of these things look like they do here. So the fact that this is highlighted in black and is bold and is a little bigger is part of the style sheet that is the default Salesforce style sheet. So I don't know how many of the people here on the call today, tell me if you ever got to work with HTML before today. Jennifer did, Rick did, that's great. Arnold didn't. Jennifer used to work on websites before Salesforce. That's great to know. I never knew that about you, Jennifer. So what we will do today is, again, Visualforce is kind of HTML, so I will try to explain things as we go through. My intention today is less concentrating on the specific language that is Visualforce, and more concentrating on how we use Visualforce together with Apex in order to create this new kind of functionality. I highly recommend, of course, the trailheads for Visualforce, and there's plenty of online resources to learn HTML. But the way that I learned it is obviously always by example. I needed to do something, and I searched how to do it, and that's pretty much how I learned it. But I love learning that way, but many people prefer to take classes or online classes and get more familiar with it. So when I started my life as a developer, I was just like everybody on this call. I started my life as a Salesforce administrator, and I created all this custom functionality as much as I could as an administrator with declarative tools before even Process Builder, using custom objects, validation, workflows, everything that is available to us. And one day I got a request from one of my users saying, hey, I needed to do something that I would like to have something that works this way. And I said, I'm sorry, but it's not possible. Salesforce page layout doesn't allow me to update multiple records within one page. And so I then decided, let me try and figure this thing out. I heard about this Apex thing and about this Visualforce thing. And my first experience with developing was actually a Visualforce page with a controller and so on. And then later I got into much more of the advanced stuff that we covered in our previous sessions. But many of you will start with triggers and so on, and maybe have already work with triggers and have never really touched Visualforce. Now, one caveat, or at least worthwhile mentioning, is the fact that Salesforce is moving to Lightning, right? And Lightning is a new technology that actually kind of circumvents Visualforce. So where Visualforce is kind of HTML and it relies on controllers, Lightning components actually use JavaScript. They do still utilize HTML to do some of the design and how things look, but it's definitely not Visualforce. So some of you may ask, so why are you teaching me Visualforce if Visualforce is going away? So the first thing I would say is Visualforce is not going away quite yet, right? Lightning, as you all know, is not quite ready for prime time for everybody. Some scenarios, it's absolutely, I think, useful and usable interface, but for many others, it just may not be ready yet. And furthermore, Lightning does support Visualforce. So if you do have Visualforce pages, you can use them within Lightning environment. So with that said, I think I had all of my preface, and it's about time to start actually looking a little bit at our code. So our page starts with Apex page, and every Visualforce has to start with the Apex page tag. And what we can see is that the Apex page tag has a couple of attributes that we are using here. The first one is called a controller. And here we defined what Apex code is going to be driving this Visualforce page. So like I showed you here, I was able to create this page without any controller, and the page can show us some information, but it's all going to be static. Static means whatever I write here is whatever is going to show up on the page. If I want this page to be dynamic in any way, meaning show me contacts or show me accounts or show me anything, I have to use a controller. Okay? And oops, sorry. And the second attribute that we're looking here is show header. And show header equals true means that, as we preview this, I can see the Salesforce header. If I change this to false, as easy as that, when this page automatically refreshes now, we now appear to be in a vacuum. It doesn't appear like we are inside of Salesforce, even though, of course, we are. But the user really has no way to navigate back into any of the tabs. For most of the use cases that I use, with some exceptions, I almost always have it set to true, because we want to maintain that, hey, I'm in Salesforce feeling. So the fact that I defined here a controller, this controller is actually our Apex class that we have here and that we will start to go over in a few minutes. I keep clicking tab. The next thing that we're going to do is define a form. So an Apex form essentially is a tag that defines we are going to now interact with data. We're going to either present some data or ask for data from the user. All of this has to be defined inside an Apex form. The next thing we have is this Apex page block, which we already looked at. And it basically defines this entire container that you can see here, all of this little thing. This is called our block. And I could actually have multiple page blocks. So if I wanted, after this page block is closed, I can open another page block and give it a title of I'm second. And I'll even close the tab in the tag in the same tag. And you can see that now we have one block here and another block underneath it. Some things you cannot have multiple of. For example, the Apex page tag, you cannot have more than one. Forms, you actually can, but it's not so recommended. There's some restrictions and things that we need to understand if we want to use more than one form. But if you look at Apex form on the developer guide, it will tell you you should only generally have one form on your page. The next thing that I have is a page block section. And a page block section is what we see under this little blue tab. And just like within a standard account Visualforce account page, where this is kind of a section, I can hide it. We can do the same thing, with our page block section. So we get a lot of this cool functionality that comes built in, and we didn't really have to do much in order to create it. Inside our section, now we start to get into some more interesting things. So now we have a Apex select list. And a select list is basically our drop-down list that we are very familiar with, a pick list in the page layout. And you can see that I did not give it a title. I gave it a size of 1, and I gave it a value. So first of all, the size of 1 controls how many values I can see in this list, because this is actually the same exact entity that I will use if I want to have a multi-select pick. And so if I change this, for example, to 5, and we refresh this page, you can see that now it's kind of a multi-select pick, but it only allows me to select 1. Even if I try Control, I can only select 1. In fact, we can see that there's an attribute here that allows me multi-select to say true. And if I said that, I'm now able to select multiple, but unfortunately, of course, it doesn't work very well for me because the code is not really designed. And this is an interesting error. Attempt to dereference a null object is something that we are probably all very familiar with from our Apex knowledge, right? So something here is trying to set a value or get a value where there's actually a null value. But I'm not actually going to try and debug this now. Sorry. And so I'm going to return it to 1 because I like it to be a drop-down. It very much indicates that we can only select 1 value. And then what I have here, value, actually indicates a variable. So everything that starts with an open curly bracket and then an exclamation point indicates now I'm actually going and using a variable. And where is this variable taken from? Well, this is coming from our controller. So we can see that I defined a public string called selected field. And this is what we reference here. And what really this means is that once I make a selection on this object, on this pick list, it's going to save that value into this variable on my controller. So I'm going to be able to reference that selection in my controller. And I'm just going to go through a couple more things here, and then we're actually going to start going into the controller and look at that. So you can see that I opened my select list tag, and I didn't close it yet because I need to give it a list of options. And here I have something called Apex Select Options, which allows me to define the options that are going to be visible in the pick list. And here I also have the attribute called value, and I reference another variable called object names. And again, if we go into my controller, we can see object names is somewhere here. Object names is a list of something called select options. And we'll talk about what that is shortly. But basically, it's a list of values that allow me to show everything that's available here. And finally, I use something called, not finally, there's actually two more tags. I use something called action support. And action support allows me to do something as a result of what the user does. In this case, I selected an event, and I say on change. This is a type of event. So actually, on events, there's preset values that we can use. So here it's on change, basically meaning every time the user makes a change in the selection, do something. It does something called re-render, and we'll talk about what that does. And finally, we have our output label, which says select the object you would like to query. And of course, we can see that here as part of our select list. So with everything that I've done so far, before I jump into the controller, are there any questions Okay, so what is a controller? A controller is essentially, just like we said, something that allows you to drive the data for a page. Salesforce actually provides us something that is called standard controllers. And any one of our objects in Salesforce, whether it's a standard object or a custom object, has its own standard controller. And the standard controller allows us to do things like get the records or save them or query them or delete them. Those are all things that are kind of defined in the standard controller. But we can actually extend those controllers. And we can say, okay, I want to be able to do all these things that Salesforce already allows me to do, but I also want to do some other things. And in that case, Salesforce actually allows us to use something called controller extension. And that actually allows me to include another controller. So if I had a page that only wants to use, let's say, account, I could actually say controller is account and have the extension be my contact query controller. And basically what that means is that this controller is what controls the page, but I'm going to add some functionality with this controller. Now, of course, this won't really work so well because I never really wrote this controller extension or this controller as an extension, and it doesn't know how to use it or how to use account specifically. But the idea is a controller is essentially what drives the data behind the page. And if we look again at the Salesforce developer guide, let's search for, I like to use directly. And so standard controllers has things like get record by ID. This doesn't really here. Let's look at methods. So things like add fields, cancel, delete, edit, get ID, get record. These are all things that you're kind of familiar, like edit, right? This is not something we really used before, but if you use it from a page, it actually allows you to enter the edit mode, just like you would from a page layout. So we're not really going to concentrate today on a standard controller. We look at a custom controller. And the reason that we're using a custom controller is because we're not actually interacting with an individual account or with account only. We're trying to interact here with many different types of records, and we don't know exactly which one it will be. It all depends on what the user wants to do. And so, if we go back to my Word file, we kind of started to talk about Visualforce, and we kind of talked a little bit about controller and controller extension, but we kind of touched on them very lightly. So let's talk about something called constructor. Look, have we ever discussed constructors? I don't think we have.
No, we have not discussed them purely on the Apex side of things.
Okay, great. So I have this nice blog article that I like. I'm going to put it on the screen. And it talks about what is a constructor. This is from a blog called SFDC Srini. Very easy to find when you Google what is an Apex constructor. And it really explains to you what a constructor is. I'm not actually going to go over this, but I will share it with you. And you could read at your own time, of course. But whenever you define a class, and we've done that, we've defined many, many different classes, you can also define something that is called the constructor. And the constructor is basically just a set of code that will automatically run as part of instantiating that class. So whenever we create a new class and we call that class, the constructor is used to kind of set the stage for what we want to do. And when we use a controller, we can use it, we don't have to, but we absolutely can use a constructor to do basically what we want to have happen when the page loads. So a constructor will always have exactly the same name as the class, and it cannot have any kind of return type. So it cannot have a string or Boolean, and it can even not have void as a return type. And if you look a little bit further down, it's called contact query controller, and down here we have public contact query controller. And this is our constructor. And we can see that when the page is loaded, the constructor is going to run because it is the page's controller. And so what will happen, we're setting this object names, which is a list defined here earlier. It's going to set some value in it, and it's going to set some value into these fields. And it will also create this list of results, which is a blank list. Also, the select option is a blank list. And it creates this string called criteria. But beyond that, that's all that happens when the page is loaded. So when we load this page right here, we can see that really nothing happens here beyond the fact that we already have this list of values. And that is what happens when we have our object names. So if you remember, when we looked at the page here, we looked at this select list, and we saw that the select options uses a variable called object names. And because we want this object names list to have values right when we load the page, we created this line here right in the constructor. So again, when the page loads, it automatically assigns these values to this object names list. And you can see that I'm assigning it a value from a list or from a class that I also define here. So in fact, we can kind of look, where is it? Sorry, in object names. Here we go. So we actually have a private list of select options called init object names. And we have some code that will eventually return some value, some list. And we'll look again exactly what that means in a moment. So when the page loads, it tries to populate values into this object names list based on this class, this method rather, I'm sorry. And this method here runs and returns something. That value gets populated back into object names, and that is then shown in my select list right here. So I'm hoping that the flow kind of makes sense right there. So let's look a little bit at the controller again and see how I defined all of these lists and variables. We were used so far to define our variables and our list a little bit closer, maybe inside of our methods, right? So you would expect to see something like list, select options, object names, and then equals something, or equals new list of select options, or whatever it is. But in this case, this list already has been defined up on the top here. And the reason that I defined it at the top of the class, or really inside the class itself and not inside any of its method or its constructor, is because I want these variables to be available throughout the entire class. So basically, any one of my methods could use these variables. And the other thing that we can see that we haven't really seen before is this concept of get and set. So if we look at our, for example, selected field, it's a public string called selected field, and it has something called get set. And what the hell is get set? I'm sorry for my use of profanity. So this kind of brings me to...
Excuse me, I have a question I wanted to put before you get too far into getters, setters. When you have list, select option, what data type is a select option? Can that just be a
I'm very glad you asked. I'm very glad you asked. So again, we'll use our very good friend, Google. I love it. And so the select option is actually a standard type of data in Apex. And it actually has basically two strings, a value and a label. Both of those are strings. And it's very, very similar to what we are used to with maps, right, where we have these key value pairs. But a select option is something slightly different. When we looked at our Visualforce page, we saw all of these drop-down values, right? And so what we see here in our list is the label. But when I make a selection here, a count, what actually goes into my variable selected field is the value of that selection. So select option is just another type of data type that Apex provides us that is essentially a data type with two values that are string values. And so I could, anywhere in this class, for example, let's go to the constructor for a second and say I could create here select option, new option. And I can say new select option and say value and label. Right, so I just gave it whatever, value 1, label 1. And then I could do the same. Or of course, like everything else, I can do a list. Right, so this would only be one option. But we wanted a list of options because there's more than one. And so I hope that kind of answers your question, Luke.
Why, yes, it does. In fact, I wish I could do that with standard pick list values.
I'm sorry?
I wished I could do that with the standard pick list values in the
I know.
interface.
I know. That's something I thought about many times as well.
Can I ask at the declaration, yes. Why is it a public get but a private set?
So you're looking at the object names, and that's a very good question. So that is a question that just jumps down about 5 minutes into our conversation. So I was just about to get into what getters and setters are.
I'm happy to wait. Thank you.
My pleasure. So we defined our variables here, and we had to kind of define something called get and set. And just like Arnold indicated, here we have something called public set and private set. But in fact, getters and setters can do a lot more than that. So let's look at another thing here. Sorry, I have too many things hiding my screen. And let's look at Stack Exchange for a moment. So Apex controllers, what do get set do? So this has been posted by someone that saw somebody else's code, saw that you have to use get set, but really had no clue what it means. And to be honest, this is how I learned Apex. This is how I learned Visualforce. I started always by copying somebody else's code, adjusting it as much as I could understand to do what I wanted it to do. But whenever I found something I couldn't understand why that is or how that works or how to modify it in a way to make it do what I wanted to do, I would use Google. And Stack Exchange and Salesforce Answers are usually where you end up, or the developer manual, right? So I'm bringing up these links because this is how I would find out, right? This is how, when I want to find out what a get set means, this is what I would do. So this person says, I've built a few Apex controllers. Like most people, have copied some code from here and there. In the controllers, there's typically an expression that looks like the following: public, some variable type, some name, get set. I initially thought I needed to supply a function to get to the get part if the Visualforce was grabbing data, something like so. So there's a very good detailed explanation here. And of course, somebody referenced even further, somebody referenced from the official documentation, what get and set mean. But really, when you think about it, when you define a variable, you can try to get that variable's value, right? So for example, if I define a variable that is a string, and then I use system debug to show that string, let me actually type it in. So I'll just do it again in the constructor. So if I define string test some text, and then I say system.debug test, what happens when system.debug runs, it actually gets the value of this string. Now, in every variable that we've defined, we've never defined get and set. So why did it work? Well, Salesforce does something called implicit getters and setters, which means if you do not define, they just work by returning the value. And so we've never really needed to use it. The same with set. When I actually set the test value here, I performed a set activity, right? So again, because I did not define any setters and getters for this test, I can just assign the value. But I could theoretically build a setter method that will take the text and reverse it or make it all lowercase and populate it. So whenever I would say string test equals to some text, I would end up actually getting the lowercase. Or I could actually return it as lowercase as part of the get statement, the get method. So if we look back to that page, what it says, get is basically public data type get var name and then a return var name. So if I write something like this, public, what was it here? Public, let's say string, and then we have get test, and we have here something, let's see. We'll call it string here, and we'll say string.to, return string dot, I probably can't use string, I'm sorry. That's a reserved code. str.to lowercase. And so now I can say, what did I just do? Now I can say test equals hello. And I should probably do this in anonymous code.
Maybe missing parentheses after to lowercase?
Yes, thank you. Maybe. Now, if this worked, what did I miss here? Line 1, column 25. This is here. Oh, I think what I need to do is
the curly bracket at the end. There's only one.
It should only be one.
Don't you have to open it to close it somewhere?
It's opened here. Close here.
Sorry.
That's okay. Let's try this a little different. Let's say string to return equals str.to lowercase. And then return to return. Is that going to work? line 1, column 25. So I'm guessing this is this. Oh, okay, that was fun.
There you go. Well done.
Hold on, it still didn't do what we don't know if it did what we wanted it to do.
It didn't
did not.
fail entirely.
Well, that's a beautiful example. I'll actually get back to this, if you guys don't mind. And I'll get that to work a bit later, or if not, then after this session. But essentially, getters allow us to control how the data is being queried from the variable, or how the data is being set into the variable. Now, whenever we define a variable that we want to use with Visualforce, we specifically have to define if it's allowing us to get or if it's allowing us to set. Now, because I just said get and set here, I am actually going to use the implicit, which basically means the default getters and setters that says, okay, I can set the data and I can get the data just like I would any other time with any other variable. Now, basically what that means is that from the Visualforce page, I can do something like use this variable as a value. I can get that variable from the controller. So for example, if I now take this, let's say object names, and if I change that from object names, public get private set, let's say private get. Now, private basically means it can only be accessed from within this class. Nowhere outside of this class is this variable going to be available. I'm going to save this. And I'm getting some error. And it says, I can't find a variable called object names in this controller. And all of this happened just because I changed this from public to private. Okay, so once I change this back to public,
so
save
this, I read that
yes.
private flag hides it from Salesforce. So when you declare it private, other portions of Salesforce can't see it.
Basically what private means, when you use private, it's only available from within this class. So if you define actually something private, like a private variable inside a method, it's only available inside that method. It's not going to be available anywhere in that class, even to other methods. If you define it as private in the class itself, it will be available to all of the methods in the class, but not anywhere outside of the class. So even if you use this constructor in some other classes, and we've seen how we can use classes from triggers, right? Use helper classes, for example. If you have a variable that is private, you will not be able to use it in your trigger. The same with Visualforce. So the reason I set this as public get and this private set is I'm saying this list of object names can only be set from this controller. We don't want to allow anybody to change it from the Visualforce page. But it's public get, meaning anybody could get the value of this list. If you do not define if it's public or private, by default, it is public. So the selected field, for example, you see it has a standard get and standard set, which means they're private. And that means that this page can see the value of this selected object. I'm sorry, yes, selected object. It can see that value. and it can also set that value. So when the user makes a change on that list, it pushes that value back into this controller. So getters and setters can become more complicated, and you can do some pretty cool things with them. And they can be defined in here, and they can also be defined differently, just like we saw on this page. So whenever you have a variable name, and you define a get variable name, and then a set variable name, in fact, I think I know why my thing didn't work. So we have to define public string test, and then we can have the get test, and maybe that will work. Or maybe it has to be under this. To be honest, I haven't touched this in a while, so let's try this. What is line 2? You know what? What I'm doing here, this should be the set, not the get. That's first of all. Because on a get, you can't pass a string, but that still doesn't work. Okay, again, as I said, I will make that work, and I will share this with the group after this call.
So can I ask, private is visible only within the class, public is visible within the org, and is global visible, is that an integration, sort of visible to the world? What's global?
Well, that's a good question. So public will be available when you instantiate the variable. So without getting too deep into it, some classes can be what we call global classes. So string is a global class where you can say string dot value off, right? And then you can just put value. You don't have to say necessarily string dot, string str equals new string. You don't have to instantiate a new member or a new entity in order to use these methods of it. So global variables or global methods allow us to use allow them to be used even without instantiating. So again, what I like to do is type here apex difference between global, public, and private. And our beautiful Salesforce use developer manual tells us everything we need to know. So private, this is the default, means that the method or variable is accessible only within the apex class in which it's defined. If you do not specify an access modifier, the method variable is private. Let's skip protected, but public means the method or variable can be used by any apex in this application or namespace. So anyone can really use it. Actually, I may have misspoke. In global, this means the method or variable can be used by any apex code that has access to the class, not just code in the same application. So a good example will be if we package something, right? If we have a packaged application that uses a namespace, so public variables will be available for any class within that namespace. But if you try to call a variable from any class outside of that namespace, you will not be able to. And this is something that's actually very typical with third-party app exchange packages. Most of the variables will normally just be public. So they can use it within their application, but you cannot access their code and access their methods. But they can expose some methods to you if they want you to be able to use them.
Got it. Thank you. I don't mean to derail the Visualforce chat.
No, please. Those are very good questions. So, with that, we kind of reviewed controllers, controller extension, constructors, getters and setters. And I think with that, before I jump in, I wanted to ask if anybody has questions about getters and setters with to the extent that we talked about them. Okay, we have a couple other things to go, and I think that after we do all that, going through the code is actually going to be much easier. So the next thing we want to talk about today is our schema. So schema is another one of these globally available methods that Salesforce provides us. Class, sorry, not method. And so one of the things that we've seen so far whenever we wanted to interact with the database, so for example, we worked with the account objects, we were able to use Sockwell to query values from specific fields. So I could say something like, select, account A, select ID name from account, limit 1, right? Because it's not a list, we always want to limit 1. So right now I was able to select the ID and name from the account object. But how can I know what fields exist in the account object? Right? Many people who come from other languages are used to being able to do something like select star from account to return all of the fields. Salesforce doesn't allow us to do this. Furthermore, what if I wanted to query this, let's say, some custom field, but I don't even know the label, and I want to display it on the page, but I don't know what the label of this. I know the API name. Or I don't want to assume that I know the label. What if the label gets changed later? Because Salesforce does allow us to change labels of fields even if they're referenced by Apex. It's not, once we reference a field in Apex, we cannot change the API name. If you try, it will tell you you can't, but you are able to change the label. So maybe you don't want to hard code the label of any field, and you want to be able to get that dynamically from Salesforce. What if you want to find what kind of record types are available on an object? All of these things are things you can't really query. You can't say, give me, select all the object types from account. It doesn't exist. To do that, we use the schema class in Salesforce. And the schema class has a couple of methods that are extremely useful for us. The first one is get global describe. And that returns a map of all of the S object names, right? So it's a map. So we know a map has a key value, and it will repair all of the object names as a key, and the tokens or the values as a value. And we'll see exactly what that means in a moment. And then describe data category groups says return a list of category. Actually, I'm not even sure what that is. To be honest, I've never used it. If you know Luke or Bill, please feel free to interrupt me. Oop. Describe S object describes the metadata. Essentially returns a list of all the fields and all of the object properties. Describe tabs allows us to get all of the standard custom apps. And group structure, again, I actually never really used. So let's see how we can use this. The first thing I've done here, I've created a new map that has a string to a schema S object type. And that is the values that get returned, the data types that get returned from the schema get global describe that we looked at here. So the key is going to be a string, which is the name of the object. And then there's a data type called schema.S object type, which is going to be the value. And as I define it, I don't even need to use something like new map. I can just assign that value from the schema right away. And you can notice that we don't need to do any Sockwell queries or anything. The schema describes classes and methods. The schema class and its methods are available to us globally across the entire Apex architecture, right? So we don't need to query or anything. It's in memory. And so I defined it here as this is what this map is. But you can notice that in the constructor, I create this thing called object names, and then I initialize the object names, right? So this is a method that I created, and let's see what this method does. This method returns a private list, and it's a private list because, again, it's only available from within this class until we return and populate it into the object names. And the object names is a list that is public. So in this initialize object names, this is really the method that's going to give us this select option list with all of the object names. And so you can see I instantiate a new list of select options, and I call it object names here. It's a new list of select options. And then I instantiate a list of string, and I call it entities. And this is a new string of list, and I cast it, or rather I give it the key set of the schema map, right? So here is the schema map that we've defined, and it has already all of the objects as names here as the key, and all of the objects as values. And so I take this key set, which is all the names, and I put it in this list of strings. Here I also use this list method called sort to sort them alphabetically. It's always easier for users to look at drop-down list alphabetically, I found. And then I just go through each record in this list of strings, each string, and I create a new select option. And in this case, the value and the label both contain just the object of the name. And then I return these object names, this list of select options, and that is what gets displayed as the select options for this page. So again, when I refresh this page, the constructor creates this list called object names, and it runs the init object names method. The init object names uses this schema.getGlobalDescribe to get the values of all of the objects in the names and of all of the objects in our organization, and it populates it into this list of select options. So again, I'm going to stop for a second and ask if there's any questions, or if hopefully this is clear. Okay. I'll take silence as Ohad, you are doing a great job presenting. We have no questions. Okay. So now that we have seen how this constructor works, what it does, and we saw how we initialize the object names, how we created this list of select options, and how we pass them back to the page, let's go back to the page and continue to see what happens here. So we closed our select list, and we close our page block section, which basically means this section is over, and we're starting a new section. Now you notice that in this page block section, I did not give any title, and that is why we don't have that blue line above it. If I added here title object selection, you'd see that little blue line above it as well. What we also remember is we looked at that selection list before, and we had some event that says that whenever there's a change, we're going to do something called re-render, something called field selection. So re-render, basically what that means, it tells Salesforce, whenever somebody makes a change in this pick list, we want to redraw this entire page block. The way that I said, reference that is, you see this field selection? In the next page block, I gave it an ID called field selection. And so when I re-render, I have to provide that ID. And so what happens whenever I make a change in my object selection, you can see that this entire section gets redrawn, and it actually has these new values. And we can see that the next page block section has 2 columns, and it has a title, Select Field to Query. It has this ID that we used in order to re-render it. And the next thing we have here is another select list. And here's the select list. And we kind of do the same thing. I have a variable to store the selection that the user made, selected field. And I have here something called select options again. This time it's going to be object fields. So before we had all of these object names, now we want to actually get the fields in this object. And so let's look at this object fields variable. Where is it? Object fields. Am I blind? Here we go. So this is a perfect example of this special getter, right? So we actually haven't really defined it anywhere here. I say public list of select options, and I call it get object fields. So anything that you prefix with get is automatically saying this is the getter method for this variable. So really, whenever I want to reference object fields, all I need to do is say object fields. And Salesforce will know to find this get object fields and use whatever code is in here to return the values. So whereas before I could say something like public list select options, right? And then I can do things like, sorry, my keyboard is a little bit annoying. And I could say, sorry. And I can say new list of select options. And then I can add some values to it. Options.add, new select option, value 1, label 1. This is kind of the structure that we've seen before, right? We've always worked with lists this way. This time, I'm just saying whenever somebody tries to get this value, I want you to run this code. And this is what is cool about this is that by doing this, every time we re-render this section, we ask the page, the Visualforce page, hey, go back to the controller and ask it for this field called this variable called object fields. And because it passes this, we already have this object names passed, the selected object, I can then use in the code that queries the fields, I can say, hey, query the fields for this selected object. So again, I'm hoping that it makes sense. But what you can see is that we have this list called fields. Right? It's a private list of select option called fields. And the first thing that I do is I clear it. I empty it out. Why do I do that? Right now I'm on Apex class and I have all of these values. If I change now to account, I can see that all the previous values are disappeared and I only have the account fields. If I did not clear that list at first, if I save this, and I save this, what you can see is that if I select account now, we can see all of this, but you can see actually that even that select object first was not removed. If I go now to any other, whatever it is, it still re-renders it, but now I can see all the account fields. And as I scroll down, I see some of these other authorization config fields that were the next object that I had. So I'll start by clearing that list, so we can start from scratch every time we try to get our object fields. And now I say something like, if queried is null, then queried is false. And you know what? I'll touch on what that does in a second, actually. So what we can do now is essentially we're saying if the selected object is null, then we add this value called select options, and we say select object first. And so this is where, when I loaded this page initially, there was no values here, because the only value that was in this list was this select object first. Because when we queried this page, the value of selected object was null. And now I say if it's not null, meaning if I already selected an object, I have a little debug statement here that will say what the selected object is. And now we need to get a string of the S object using schema map. So just like we had that schema, we created this schema map using schema get global describe. Now we use a little thing inside it. So schema.s object field, this data type that we looked at, has its own methods. It's actually exactly one method, and that's called getDescribe. So when I queried all of these objects, we got the key was the name, and then the value was this S object type, schema.s object type. And this one would have a getDescribe. And getDescribe returns a list of all of the fields. So again, I created a new map. This map is called field map. And it returns, it has a value of string to another object type. Before we had S object type, now we have S object field. And so we use this schema map, and we get from that the selected object, right? So the name of the object was account, and that was the key for our schema map that we created up here. And so it says get this object S object type for account, and use the getDescribe method on it. And then the getDescribe has another method called fields, and then getMap. And so now we populated this map of string to S object field, and the string has the, if I remember, I think this, let's see, getDescribe.fields. So now we have all these different values. We can find about the field that we queried, right? So this map has a name of the field, and then it contains the field itself as an S object field that has all of these different values we can query, like if it's a number, precision, pick list values, length, label, number of digits, what else? Things that we are familiar with. Is accessible, basically says if the current user can see this field or not. Is it an auto number? Is it calculated? Is it a formula field? Is it a custom object or standard? A custom field or standard field, and so on, right? All these different values that we can set on a field, we can now find out about this field. And so what I do now, I go through this map, and in fact, I go through all of the values in this map, and now I just try to get some of the things. I want to get the get describe, right? This is just the get describe of this current field. And then I'm saying field name is this describe.getLabel, and I add it to a select option called fields, right? Which was this select option variable we defined above here. Where was it? Fields. Oh, right here, I was on it. So I basically now say add. If you remember, we started by clearing out this list of fields. And now as I iterate through all of the fields in this object that we found, that we selected, I add to the fields a new select option that has the field name as both the value as the label. And I also created a new map called field API name map, which is defined here, field API name map, that is a string to a string. And here I put in it, where am I? Sorry, I skipped it, here we go. And in this I put the field name as the key, and the value is the get name, which actually returns the API name. Returns the field name used in Apex, that's the API name. So to the fields list, it's a select option, and I added both the value and the label, just the name of the field, right? Basically saying, hey, it's a account type or account name or contact name or whatever. And then here I created a map that allows me to compare, to find later the API name based on the name that would be returned from the select list. Finally, I return these fields as the result of this get object fields. So whenever this page block section renders, it renders once when the page loads, and then once every time that we make a change in our object list. So whenever it renders, it goes back to your controller and says, hey, give me these object fields. And whenever I say that, it basically would go through this get object fields. It would clear the current list of fields that if it was there, which was there because when the page loaded, it already populated it here. And then if we selected an object, it would go through, it will use that selected object to query all the fields using the schema map that we queried. And then we're basically building two variables here. One would be just that select options, which we are using for our select list, and another map that we're going to use in a moment. So again, when I first load the page, this is instantiated because this is still null. I haven't made any selection. This is instantiated as only this select object first. But once I make a change here, this gets re-rendered and has all of these fields. Now, the reason you're seeing this is because after I uncommented it, where was it? This one, I did not save it. And now when I save it, it will remove that select object first. And I only have these fields. Okay. I will pause again for a moment, and I will ask if anyone has any questions or comments or telling me, Ohad, slow down, you're crazy, we can't follow. That is also acceptable. Or Ohad, go faster, you're too slow for us, stop repeating yourself. That will also be acceptable. Wow, silence. Is anybody here? Am I talking to myself?
No, this is some really good stuff, Ohad.
This is good. This is it's a lot. There's a lot of new concepts in here, but I like how it's put together. Like, you know, I can see why you introduced like the schema describe because it really gives that that example of how dynamically it is switching between significant amounts of data from each of the different objects that you select.
Yep. So yeah, so I mean, one of the cool things is, I mean, when Bill and I were thinking what to create here, the first thing we were saying, that's why the name of the page is Contact Query, because at first we thought, okay, let's just allow them to query the contact, and that would have been a much simpler page, and maybe in hindsight I should have started with that and then jump into this, because that would have just been using things you already are familiar with, a list of contacts, and then a SQL statement to select the contacts based on some value on the page and so on. But then I just thought it would be much cooler if we do something a little bit more advanced. So I know we're introducing a lot of new concepts here at once. And what I would really love after this session is over is for everybody to take some time to review this code and really try to understand what we did here. And any questions that you have, I would be very happy to field.
Yeah,
okay.
I was thinking I might try and sort of reverse engineer this for a situation where I'm just providing two groups of items. One that represents like the object that you have, and then a sublist of values for that. I think if I went in and did that, it would make me have to make changes to the code, deal with some of the errors, figure out what they are, but would really help me to wrap my head around how the pieces fit together.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we had some plans on if we have time to give some to-do tasks here that would allow people to get a little bit more familiarized with it. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we'll have time. By the time I finish this, it looks like we may be out of time. But it may be worthwhile to do some exercises around this in our next session, and you and I can talk about whether it's something we want to do later.
Right, do that, and also work out what the unit test for this would look like.
Yep, exactly. We did not have the time to write a unit test, so that would be maybe a perfect way to kind of get more familiarized with it. Okay, so far we looked at this controller. We saw all these variables I described. We looked at the constructor that runs right away when the page is loaded. We looked at this. Interestingly, what you can see is that these things are not necessarily ordered in the way that you'd expect them to run. But it doesn't really matter as far as the Apex is concerned, because it only runs where it needs to run, right, each one of those. But again, we looked at the constructor first. That's what runs when the page loads. The constructor calls this init object names, which is this method, which gets all of the names of the objects and populates them into a list of select options that is then used by the page. And then when the user makes a change, actually even during the page load, this get object fields method is also called, but when the page loads, it has no value for selected object, so it only has this one value. And then when the user makes a change and the section is re-rendered, this variable is queried again, which then allows us to say, okay, now return something that's based on the selected object, and we return the list of fields in the selected object. And so we kind of described everything that happened so far, right? Selecting this, seeing the fields. And now I can select whatever I want here. I'll use account type because I know the values that are available. And now we have this other functionality that allows me to query something against this field, right? So let's look at how that works. Sorry, we'll go into the Visualforce page first. And so we looked at this page block section that has this select the object you like to query. We looked at that, and then we have this select the fields to query, right? And so that was this list. And then we have a new Apex tag that we haven't seen so far, right under the select list, called Apex command button. And as you might guess, this is this little cute button here. the command button has, in this case, 3 attributes. The first one is the action. And the action, you can see again, it references something from the apex. We can see that based on that open curly bracket and exclamation. And this calls something called button perform query, which is another method in our class, button perform query. It also does something else. It re-renders another panel. And so we saw this re-render, right? And now it's re-rendering this something called output panel, and we'll look at that in a moment. But basically it says, once this button is clicked, I want it to redraw this button, this panel here. And finally, the value is what's going to actually be shown on the button. In this case, it's query exclamation point. And then we have one more tag that is called Apex input text. And input text allows us to do exactly what you would imagine. It's this little input text section. And it has a value called criteria. And again, based on this little open curly exclamation, we know that this is something that's going to get pushed back into our controller. So basically, this says that, hey, whatever the user is inputting here, I want you to put this in this variable called criteria, which conveniently we have defined here as a public string with getSet. And we also have another sub-tag inside the input text, which is the output label that has query value. And of course, we can see that on the page here, query value. And that closes our page block section. So this entire section has just 3 elements in it: a select list, a button, and an input text. What's interesting is, because we have 2 columns, we have defined here 2 columns, the first tag that I will use, that I have here, the select list, will be the first element in our first column. The second one will be in the second column, and then the third one will be in the third, because there's only 2 columns, we get this as a second entity on the first column. So this is very similar to page layout, right? So this is number 1. You have kind of a column separator here, and then number 2 is this button, and then number 3 is again in column 1. Now what we can do, unlike page layouts, I can actually have 4 columns if I wanted, or because we only have 3 entities here, I'll say it's 3. And when I save this, we can actually have this in 1 line if we wanted. Right? So you can have way more than 2 columns if you wanted right here. You can have 5 or whatever, but of course you need to worry about your spacing, depends on what in each column and so on. Change it back to 2 because I like to have my query under my field selection, and I like to have the button on the right. So before we jump into what this button does, let's look at what we have underneath here. We have something called an Apex output panel. So output panel is kind of a container that allows us to put things inside it. It's inside a panel, but it doesn't necessarily display anything. It could, but I'm going to leave it as is right now. In this panel, we have a page block. And inside that page block, we have something called page block table. And inside this page block table, we have all these different columns. So we're basically building a table, and we're saying this column is going to be this value, this column is going to be that value. We'll dive deeper a little bit into it in a moment. Then I close my table, I close my section, I close my output panel, I close my page block, I close my form, and I close my page, and that is the end of the page. Now, there's something pretty cool that we can see here. On this page block section, we use a new attribute. So we use this ID, but we also use something called rendered. And in this case, rendered, what it does, it controls, do I want to show this page block section or not? So rendered accepts a Boolean. So it's either going to be a true or false. If it's false, we're just not going to see this display page block section. It's just not going to put it on the screen. If it's true, it will show it. So if I take this little attribute and I delete it from this page, and I save it, what you'll see is that now we actually have this page block section showing results and this empty table. It doesn't actually have any values in it because we haven't performed our query. By adding this rendered, I'm able to say, hey, don't show it when we just start. Okay? And this is also, if you remember, when we looked at our controller, I had here, if queried is null, then queried is false. Basically what I'm saying is, whenever we get these objects, if I haven't defined, if I queried already, define it as false. No, I have not pressed the query button. Okay? But now we get to look at our button perform query. And what you can see here, is, I'll jump to the end, I'm setting this queried as true. And the queried again is a Boolean that is public and has a standard get set, which means I can query it from the page. So in other words, when I just start this page, this queried gets instantiated as false. Where was it? As false. And once I query, it gets changed to true. And that is how I can control if I want to show that table underneath or not. So before I query, I don't want to show a dirty, meaningless, empty table. It's just the junk and distraction for the user. So I'm able to hide it at first. But once I press query and I re-render it, it will show it. Now the reason that I had to use a panel here is that I cannot re-render a section and expect it to also evaluate if it has to be rendered or not. That is just a limitation. So instead of trying to re-render this, I'm re-rendering some container above it. In this case, the container is output panel. And when I'm re-rendering the panel, it actually is able to evaluate again if it needs to be rendered or not. So if I just re-render this, it would never re-evaluate if it needs to be rendered or not. Okay. Now that we looked at the page, let's look at what our button perform query does. So one of the interesting things that we've seen so far is whenever we use the select statement, we always use something like this, right? Select ID name from account, right? Where blah, blah, blah. But we always have to specify the object name. So because our page allows us to select different objects, how can we create a SQL statement that will always return the right response? This is where we actually encounter something called dynamic SQL, sorry. And so in order to create a dynamic SQL, we actually start by creating a string that will have that select statement. Exactly the same select statement that you would write normally in your code. But now we're actually writing it as a string. And what you'll see here, this is a little interesting. So first I have select ID, name, created by, created date, last modified by, last modified date. I have a comma here, and I want to add another field to our query. And that is always going to be the field that we selected here. So I'm going to use that map that I created before. If you remember, the list of fields we see here are the name of the fields, account space name, account space type. But if you know the account object, you know that the account type field name in the API is actually just type. The account name is just name, right? So when you build your statement, your SQL statement, your select statement, you have to use the API name, not the name that is shown here. And this is the reason why I built that map earlier that has a map with a key of the name and a value of the API name. And so I simply use a simple get on the selected field, right? The selected field holds the value that the user selected on the page here. And that will return, in this case, type. So I'm adding that after the comma. And then after all of this, I'm saying also continue adding to the string. And then I have from. And now I use the selected object. In this case, it's going to be account. And then I add where. And I can now use again that API name of the field name, in this case account type. And I'm saying whenever it's like, and then I use this escaping because I want to use a quote, an open quote, single quote inside a string. So whenever you want to use a special character, like an open quote, you have to use something called escaping, which is essentially preceding it with a forward slash. If you, by the way, wanted to use a forward slash in your string, you escape the forward slash itself. 2 forward slashes would basically give you 1 inside your string. But basically I'm saying when it's like, and then I add this criteria, which is the field the user provided here. And so this is why I can now type something like customer in query, and I get all of the ones where the type contains customer in it. If I just wrote channel here, and query, I would just get those customer channel results. Okay, let's continue. Now I have another field here, selected field API. I don't even remember why we do this. Let's see in a second. But we have the API name of the selected field. Oh, I know why. Then I use a system debug to actually put just debug that select statement. So what's interesting, if we see the last query, and I look at the debug, here's our line 69, which is this statement. And here we have select ID, name, created, blah, 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 and type, right? It was used from that map that we use, from account, where type like channel. So you can see that the select statement was, we were able to build the select statement very, very dynamically based on values that the user provided to us. And we didn't have to hard code any of those into the select statement. Finally, once we have that string, we have a list called results. And results is an interesting list by itself. But before I talk about it, I basically populate into it database.query, and I provide a query string. So database.query is exactly like saying select and providing the select statement. But database.query allows us to query for a specific dynamic string. Okay, let's talk a little bit about results. Let's look at what this result list is. So results is a list of, it's a public list, but it's not a list of account. It's not a list of case. It's a list of S-object. And this brings me to one of the last things we haven't looked at yet, using S-object data type. So S-object essentially is a very, very generalized type of data element, where Salesforce says you can put any kind of S-object in it. You can put an account, you can put a list, you can put whatever type of object, whether it's a standard object or a custom object, you can put it into this list. And this is very, very crucial, because if we didn't have this data type S-object, I would have to define a list for every type we want to query. I would have to define a list for account and case and blah, blah, blah. And I would have to say if the selected object is case, then query into the case list. If the selected object is account, query into the account list. But without this S-object data type, we wouldn't be able to have this page so dynamic to return results from any type of object we select. S-object has some restrictions. We can't do everything with S-object that we can do with standard object list or custom object, with a specific object list, I would say. But generally, you can get from an S-object into any other kind of object as well. And there's things called casting, where you can move it from an S-object to a list of a specific object type, so you can work with it. But For our purposes, we can do a lot less. I actually return here the system debug of the size. How many records did we find on this query? I changed query to true, and that's pretty much it. And I say queried perform, queried is, and then I have this true showing back. So if we look at the log, queried perform, queried is now true. And by the way, the reason I had this debug statement is when Bill and I were building this class, we couldn't figure out why when we were clicking on the button, this section wasn't showing up. At first, when we tried to do this, we clicked query. In the debug statement, I could see the query was running, but this section would not show up. And so I added this little debug statement saying, show me what the value of query is. And we can see here that it's true. And then I did a little Google, and then I remembered, oh, wait a second, you cannot change the rendered status on the element that you are re-rendering. You have to change to re-render something above it. And that's when we realized we had to create this panel. And then, of course, once we did it, it worked. So we can see basically once I click this button perform query, it builds this query statement, the select statement. It uses this database.query to query the database and put it in a generalized S-object list, changes the query to true, so we know to render this section, and that's it. And then on this page, we are going to use this list to present the users to the user. So we're using, again, something called page block table. It's an element that Apex provides to us that allows us to build the table very easily without having to use the standard HTML table, TD, TR to build columns and lines. Salesforce will do all of this for you. Essentially, you can replicate page block table by using Apex repeat, which would essentially iterate through a list, and setting up your own table using standard HTML. But this is much easier and much faster. So on the page block table, we have a value. And the value, again, using this exclamation point, you know that we're going to something in the controller. And basically, we're getting this list of results that is a list of S-object. And we have to assign it a variable. The variable is how we are going to reference this, the current value as we iterate through the list. So it's basically just like a for statement where we say, in a for statement, we will say, for string S in whatever, list of strings, right? So list of strings may be a list of strings that we defined before, maybe list of list strings equals new list of strings, right? And so S is our variable, is our iterating variable, the variable that we use every time we iterate through the list. The same exact thing with Visualforce. Every time we iterate, we're going to reference R as our individual record from this result. And so now we use this R.id. Because we use S-object, we can't do things like R.name. If I used any other type of object, like account, I could just say R.name or R.created by and so on. Because we use S-object, it's just a little bit more complex, and we have to use this square bracket notation. But essentially, that allows me to pick the name, the created by, the created date, the last modified by, the last modified date, and the selected field API. So I want to return always these 5 fields plus the one field that the user queried. And we can see that selected field API, that's what I had here as the selected field API. I stored it here, so we're able to show it. Okay, so let's go over this page one more time. When I first instantiate the page, it already populated the list of objects using that init_obj_names method. And I can select any one of them. Once I make a selection, it fires the onChange, which re-renders this section and that calls the getter method for the field names. The getter method will now say, okay, I already know what the object is, in this case account. Let's query all of the fields. Let's get the describe for all of the fields in this object, build a select option list from it, and pass it back to the page so we can show all the fields to the user. When I make a selection here, it doesn't actually make anything because on this code here, we don't have any. While we have that action support on change on the object name, we don't have any action support on the field name. And that's fine because I don't want anything to happen when I change. I only want something to happen when I click the query button. So I can select anything here. I don't really know any of the other values to, I think there's like an account name Acme. But just to show that we can select anything in query. Okay, we got some error. This is actually pretty good. It says duplicate field selected. Now this is an interesting thing because I selected name. What happens, let's look at this select statement. The select statement says select ID, name, created by, created date, modified by, last modified date, because this was hard-coded. But then I also added name because it was the user selected field. So this shows you when you build dynamic queries, you actually have to be very careful what you put in your select statement. In fact, there's probably a whole session we can talk about security when it comes to dynamic SQL statements. Because theoretically, you can give the user access to a lot of data. If they know names of fields or so on, you have to be really careful. But the bottom line is, because I queried name twice, I got an error. So I could fix it by saying, you know, if this, what I would probably do, to do it correctly, I would probably create a list of all the fields that I want to query. Not a list, actually, a set. And then I would say if the selected field is, if that set contains the selected field, then don't add it, otherwise add it. But in any case, in this case right now, we just cannot select name because it would be showed twice. So I'll go back to account. Let me refresh this page. I'll now continue to use account type just because that's the one I know. And I'm going to type channel. And so once I click the query, it dynamically builds a SQL statement, queries into a subject, modifies that queried Boolean to true, and re-renders this section. Because the query is now true, it actually shows us this table. And now I can see all these 5 hard-coded fields, plus the 1 extra that we queried above here. Okay, we're pretty much out of time. I do want to show one more thing. If I try to go here and say account number, for example, contains 15, I'll get another error. Actually, no, because account number, even though it's a number, it's a field. Let's try created date equals contains 01. I'll get something interesting. Oh, of course I can't do that.
Try zip code. Oh, I
zip
think
code.
I know what you're going for.
Yep. Let's use zip code. And I'll try to say contains 15. Nope. Which one has a number in it, an actual number? Yeah, zip code is actually text because you can have dashes and whatnot in it. Who knows what field on the account actually has a number?
Yeah, I'll double check it. I think
street address, shipping address, billing address should be.
No, those will be all text.
Street. Oh, so you want to like a number
even.
data type?
Yeah. So this is interesting because now it says the like operator is only valid on string fields. Now, because we hard-coded the like condition in our, the like criteria in our statement, we can only use this on strings. So again, we can use more code here to say, okay, if the field type is not string, use equals or use something else. We can do all of these things now because we have this get described. And if you remember, when we look at the get describe, we can get a lot of information about data type. Get type, and it tells you if it's a string or whatever, right? And so you can say if it's not string, don't use like. So there's a lot more we can do to improve this class, but I was hoping this would be a pretty substantial introduction to Visualforce and what the power of Visualforce allows us to create. I mean, when you think about it, it's not a very simple example to learn from, maybe, but there's only 74 lines on the controller and only 38 lines on the Visualforce page, and we created relatively complex functionality here. And by just adding another maybe 10 lines to the Visualforce and another 10 lines to the controller, we can probably, and that was one of the things I wanted to do like as an exercise, we could relatively easily do a mass update now to say update this field on all of these accounts queried with a new value, right? So very easily we can create a page here that allows a user to query any kind of object and any kind of field from any kind of object and do a mass update for that field on all of these objects that they queried. And that may be something we'll forage into for our next session. So maybe that's a good example to try and tweak and play with this thing a little bit and get a little bit more into details, maybe into getters and setters, and write the test class for this thing. But with that, I think we are at the top of the hour, and we are kind of out of time. So before we shake hands and say goodbye, I would again like to open the floor to any kind of questions. I know there was a lot of silence because there was a lot to get in today. I went over a bunch of new concepts.
How do you learn to think like a Visualforce developer, like to anticipate that you should re-render a section or clear a list of fields as you did in this component?
Well, interestingly enough, I think that the best way to learn how to think like a Visualforce developer is to start writing Visualforce.
Sure. Yeah.
In fact, when Bill and I were working on this, it's been a long time since I actually wrote. I mean, I manage developers, so I review Visualforce and Apex a lot, but I don't really create a lot anymore from scratch. So when we were going over this and creating this Visualforce page, Bill can attest. I mean, it took me some time to remember some of these things and figure out some of these things, even though they seem relatively simple, maybe. But the bottom line is, how do you know to clear the fields? I didn't clear the fields. And as we started to play with the page, we saw that as we're changing values, the list of fields gets longer and longer. You know, so in the end of the day, as you start to build it, you'll find a lot of these issues. And
right. So I guess it is one of those. It's just part of the development process.
I mean, it is. I mean, again, you learn, and there's best practices, and you can read a lot more about it, and you can learn how to do these things in advance. For me, I find that I learn best with the kind of trial and error. So I just like getting my sleeves, roll up my sleeves and just jump into code. Google a lot, figure out how to do it as I develop it, and just trial and error. When you get into user interface, testing becomes a lot more of a manual activity because you can't really write a test class for Visualforce. I mean, you still need to test your controller, but you can't really predict what the user is going to do.
Right.
And this is where, so far when we wrote test classes in all of our sessions, we kind of knew what the inputs that we're getting, and we kind of knew what the outputs we're expecting. So it was relatively easy to test. But when you start developing user interfaces or any kind of interaction with the user, you have to start thinking, what can the user screw up? And so your tests are now starting to be, okay, I expected a string in this search criteria, right? But what happens if the user provides a number? Or what happens if the user provides a date? Or if I expected a date and the user provides a text, right? So the first thing you'll do is, of course, you want your page to be able to handle these things correctly. So that's one element. But also in your test class, you want to make sure that your methods are able to handle incorrect inputs. And this is where when you write your test classes, you always want to have both your positive and your negative tests. Make sure the class handles it correctly when I pass the kind of input that I expect. So if, in other words, if I entered channel, it returns a customer with a account where the type contains the word channel. That we can do that test relatively easy. But you also want to test that when the user provides something else, your class, your method knows how to handle it and doesn't crap out. So, I think this is kind of where we take everything we've learned so far and we start to see, beyond just triggers, which triggers are, I'm not trying to dismiss or say they're not important. I write triggers and I work with triggers a lot. But when you start to look at user interfaces, things start to become usually a little bit more complex, and I think a little bit more fun too, because you get to interact, to do all these cool things. And personally, whenever I develop a new user interface and I get it to do something really cool, like this dynamic page even, I get this really cool sense of satisfaction. I created something that wasn't really there before, something that you couldn't do without writing Visualforce and Apex. So that's just personally me.
Oh, great. Yeah, I can actually contest, Luke, to the all the dynamic components that Ohad put in there. We were originally architecting some static stuff, and I just saw it come to life. The way we were grabbing the multiple objects and how we were querying fields, some real innovative stuff here.
Well, at first we just thought to query contact, and we thought query contact and allow the user to select either name or first name or last name or email. And then I said, wait, what if the user wants to query another field of the contact? And then as we started doing this, I said, well, you know what, why if the user wants to query another object? So that's how it kind of became this page, which is not simple, but I think a really nice introduction to what you can do with Visualforce.
Oh, I'm looking forward to sort of reverse engineering it and seeing to practice the concepts and probably hit you guys with some questions and errors that I get. Great.
And maybe that's you and I can talk tomorrow maybe about what we want to do with the next one, but it might be a good plan to do exactly that with the group next week.
Sounds good.
Okay. If there's no other questions, I apologize for keeping you over the time, and I hope you found this session interesting, and I'll bid you farewell and good night.
Thanks for the opportunity to ask questions as it goes along. That's exactly what I need for Visualforce.
Great. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, guys.